Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic. I enjoy this. Let's do it. Who is a person that was ridiculed at the time but was ultimately proven right? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Alfred Wegener, who first proposed continental drift, what would ultimately become plate tectonics. Geologists of the day considered him an outsider and rejected his theory. Christine Collins, famously portrayed by Angelina Jolie in the movie Changeling. After her son was abducted, the police found him months later and reunited them. But Christine was adamant that it wasn't her son Walter and was an imposter. Even though she had evidence to prove it, she was temporarily committed by the officer in charge of the case, and even after the kid admitted he lied and wasn't Walter, it still took over a week to release Christine. Kotaku Wamura. He was the longtime mayor of the Japanese town of Fudai, 1940s to 1980s. While mayor, he learned that the town had been devastated in the past by tsunamis. He literally saw the bodies from one of the disasters and ordered the construction of an enormous seawall. While other towns in the area also had seawalls, this thing was considerably insanely high, or overkill. The project was hideously expensive, and he was relentlessly mocked. He died in 1997. In 2011, a tsunami struck Japan, killing 20,000 people. The seawall worked as planned, protecting Fudai, and the town escaped almost untouched. Some of the elderly patients with dementia in a home in my city kept complaining they weren't given food. Everyone thought they must have forgotten that they'd already eaten, as people with dementia sometimes do. Nope. Turns out some pieces of shit nursing staff didn't always give everyone their meals, amongst other abuse. Gustave Caillebotte. He was born to a wealthy Parisian family in 1848. His father owned a textile business that he later inherited. He was an artist in his own right, but became much more known as a supporter of the arts. Fearful he'd die young, he writes in his will that the French state accept his large art collection, today valued at several $billion, and hang art from several Impressionist artists who were friends of his in a national museum upon his death. Caillebotte dies young, 45, in 1894, as he predicted, and so his will attempts to be executed. The French government initially refuses the request. Pundits and critics, from art to politics, view the request as absurd and publicly say how repulsed they are by the collection itself. Several art professors from École des Beaux-Arts threatened to resign if the government enacts the will. In the end, half of Caillebotte's art collection gets hung in 1897 at the Musée du Luxembourg, and the public comes out in droves to visit the gallery because of all the press Caillebotte's request had received after his death. People wanted to see this ugly art. The artists featured, their names were Monet, Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, Manet, Pissarro, and Sisley. It's very possible these artists would never have become the household names they are today had Caillebotte not liked the ugly, unsellable art that a few of those friends of his made. Writer Ernest Hemingway was convinced the FBI had him under surveillance. His friends and family told him he was nutters, until some unsealed records a while back proved that he actually was being followed, had his phones bugged, etc. Ludwig Boltzmann. His equations and formulas explain the physical properties of matter, but as it went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of the atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. Sister Kenny and her physical therapy for polio victims. The treatment at the time was to lock up the affected limbs in braces or casts, leaving the patient crippled for life. Her idea of using hot compresses and gently moving the limbs took a very long time to be accepted by the medical establishment, as she was a woman and just a nurse. Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1846, Semmelweis proposed the idea that hand-washing could prevent the spread of disease in hospitals. He was ridiculed during his time, sent to a mental asylum, and died forgotten by his peers. My grandma. She insisted people kept stealing her newspaper, and specifically said it was someone in a white van. Grandma was always a little off, so we just thought she was paranoid and had a bad delivery person. Until one day my mom and I are driving past her house, and a white van in front of us stopped, stole my grandma's newspaper, and drove off. Grandma wasn't crazy after all. At least, not about that. Barry James Marshall was one of the scientists who discovered the bacteria H. pylori causes stomach ulcers. However, getting people to believe it was difficult. It was thought that lifestyle and excessive stomach acid were the main factor that lead to ulcers. So when he suggested that a bacterial infection could cause it, no one believed him. In response, he infected himself with H. pylori by drinking cultures, which in turn gave himself stomach ulcers, and then treated the infection. He and Robin Warren received a Nobel Prize for this discovery. John Lydon of the Sex Pistols tried to warn the world about the crimes of Jimmy Savile in an interview in 1978 and was banned from appearing on the BBC for his troubles. Jose Canseco was one of the first players to openly discuss how prevalent steroid use was in the 90s and 2000s, and people dismissed his claims as being from a player on decline just trying to stay relevant. The lady who got burned from McDonald's coffee. If I recall, she was so injured she lost 20% of her body weight while hospitalized. McDonald's was later discovered to be intentionally selling nuclear hot coffee because you couldn't drink it quickly and thus ordered fewer refills. Rose McGowan. She was talking crazy shit about people following her and her ex-Mossad agents being involved. She was dismissed as insane. Turns out, Weinstein had an army of spies he had following victims to keep them quiet, including the exact people she had described. Martha Mitchell, wife of John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General. Martha kept saying that there was hanky-panky going on, but nobody listened to her. Marshall McLuhan. His theories on how media usage changes how we think and interact with each other were prophetic. He predicted the internet and how a worldwide instant form of communication would create tribes of people centered around their own echo chambers. He also wrote about how using media changes how we think and process information. Considered a crazy pop culture media and literature speculator in the 60s, now his ideas have been pretty much confirmed by modern neuroscience and communication study. Sadly, he died before the internet happened. It would have been incredible to see his theories on social media. Harlem J. Bretz was a geologist who in the 1920s proposed that the geologic features of the channeled scablands of eastern and central Washington were the result of a massive flood during the last ice age, about 15,000 years ago, when a glacial dam in northern Idaho catastrophically collapsed, releasing the waters of Lake Missoula. Lake Missoula is estimated to have contained a volume of water equivalent to Lake Erie and Ontario combined, and the resulting flood through what is now eastern Washington and out through the Columbia Gorge released a water flow exceeding the combined flow of all other rivers on the planet. Bretz was soundly ridiculed when he proposed this scenario in the 1920s, but was eventually vindicated over the next 50 years and was eventually awarded the Geological Society of America's prestigious Penrose Medal in 1979 at the age of 96. By that time, as he put it, all his detractors were dead, so he had no one left to gloat over. The many British postal workers fired and prosecuted for stealing. Many were lifelong employees. Some committed suicide. This went on for almost 2 decades. Spoiler, it was a surveillance software glitch that went ignored for years. They were all innocent. Hannibal Buress. He was a first prominent voice to call out Bill Cosby. At a time where in the black community saying bad shit about Cosby is like being a Catholic and bad-mouthing the Pope. Gary Webb. The San Jose Mercury news reporter that uncovered the CIA link to crack cocaine in Los Angeles. The government used other newspapers to discredit him. A few years later, he was found at his home with 2 bullet holes in his head, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. He was right. Every time this topic comes up, I'm happy, and also sad at the same time, to see Gary Webb's name come up. Truly somebody that more Americans should know. Jeremy Renner played him in a movie called Kill the Messenger. I know I said that before, but if you haven't, you should definitely look it up because, let the facts speak for themselves. What happened to Gary? Rest in peace. I had an aunt or cousin, not really aunt, but everyone in Spanish families calls everyone tias and primas. So who even knows? Anyway, she was convinced her then 35-year-old husband was having an affair with her much younger 20-year-old cousin. Last summer, she let the cousin stay during a visit to the States. It got to the point where her own family thought she was being crazy. They ended up getting separated, and she was thought of as the paranoid person in the family, and a lot of people sadly turned on her and stopped being in contact. The divorce happened shortly after. And guess who a year after the ex-husband ends up marrying? Jackie Stewart. He was sick and tired of burying his friends due to racing accidents, so he started advocating for safety at the tracks, in the cars, and pushing for more qualified medical professionals. He once said, "I'd be more popular if I would shut up and drive. Dead, but more popular." Stewart was a 3-time world champion for the record. He also won on the hardest track ever built, the Nürburgring Nordschleife, by 4 minutes with a broken wrist. The man was a hard racer, as they come, and yet he was ridiculed for not wanting to see himself and others get injured or killed while racing. Many of the things Stewart pushed for then are requirements at nearly every racing event today. Barry Marshall. Remember in the 80s when everyone seemed to have ulcers and they were basically treated with Tums? Marshall was a researcher who discovered the H. pylori bacteria caused ulcers, not just too much acid in the stomach. Unfortunately, no one would believe him. So he literally documented himself drinking the bacteria, getting ulcers, and successfully treating them with antibiotics. Barbara Lee was the only member of U.S. Congress to vote against the post-9/11 authorization for use of military force because it was too broad and did not have a clear objective or duration, warning that it could lead to an endless war. For this, she was harassed and threatened for her position and safety. Turns out, the AUMF resolution was indeed a blank check for the Pentagon to use military force on whoever they wanted for the foreseeable future. Many, many years ago, a new stoplight was installed near my house at a fairly busy multi-lane intersection. The first time I went to this light, I was taking a left, waited in my left turn lane until I got a green arrow, and proceeded into the intersection, as did the person coming from my left who was going straight, and also had a green light. We almost crashed, but at the time I assumed they had run the light, and I'm sure they assumed the same about me. On my way home, I sat in an adjacent parking lot and watched, and sure enough, the lights were timed completely wrong, and giving conflicting drivers the right of way at the same time, and I saw 3 other near misses in about 10 minutes. I called the police to report it, and they essentially laughed at me. The next day, 2 people died in a crash at the intersection, and they fixed the light by the end of the next night. I'm guessing they wished they had taken a look when I told them about it. When I was a cop, there was this lady who called every week and said someone had been in her house. Dozens of cops went out there, and she would say, her dresser drawer was open, and she knew it had been closed when she left the house. Never any signs of forced entry, no prints, nothing to say this was anything other than a crazy person. Until months later, one of her high school students was caught with a key to her house. Turns out, the kid had been sneaking in and just moving shit slightly to F with her.